You know, it's a fascinating question, right? What happens when two people start in basically the same place, take completely different roads, but somehow end up at the exact same destination? Well, in this explainer, we're going to trace the really personal journeys of two ex-Muslims to see just how much our environment can shape and even reshape our deepest beliefs.
So this whole story unfolds to a really fascinating conversation between two French ex-Muslims, Shana and Majid. And, as Majid himself points out, it's not just about the fact they both left their faith. He says their differences are just as important. So let's dive in and trace their very distinct paths, right from the beginning.
Okay, so both China and Majid kicked things off from a pretty similar starting point. They're both kids of immigrants growing up in France, and they found themselves navigating what they call a dual culture. You can imagine, right? Kind of caught between their Islamic heritage on one side and their Western French surroundings on the other.
And, right away, even though both of their childhoods were pretty westernized, you can already see their paths starting to split. For Chana, her family was moderate, so Islam was kind of just in the background, more of a cultural identity. But for Majid, after 8 totally secular years, getting sent to the mosque was a real shock to the system. The strictness, the rituals he called ridiculous, it didn't inspire faith in him at all. Actually, it did the opposite. It immediately sparked questions.
And this brings us to the first major fork in the road for them, the way they each experience gender relations. I mean, this wasn't just a minor difference. It was a massive one that would go on to shape their entire relationship with their faith and their culture. A real game changer.
For Chana, the rules were, well, they were absolute, no gray area. Even though her family was pretty moderate in other ways, any interaction with the opposite sex was a complete non-starter, strictly forbidden. And the reason for all this? It all came down to preserving the honor of the family.
And yeah, this wasn't just some simple guideline. It created this whole cascade effect of social isolation. I mean, it got to the point where she was eventually forbidden from having female friends too, because they might be a bad influence. Now, imagine trying to explain that to your classmates in a regular mixed French school. She couldn't, and that led to so much confusion, shame, and even harassment.
Majid's experience, though, it was a complete opposite. I mean, night and day. He grew up in the French school system where friendships between boys and girls were just normal. It was the default. So when he looked at the super strict gender segregation in more religious families, it didn't seem holy or sacred to him. It just seemed alien. It just didn't compute.
So you can see how all these early differences are really setting the stage for what's coming next. As they grew up and became adults, their paths didn't just diverge a little bit. They shot off in completely opposite directions. One of them moves deeper into the faith, while the other starts pulling away from it entirely.
So for Chana, that journey inward was really driven by that feeling of isolation we talked about. She secretly started talking to a religious boy, and he's the one who introduced her to more formal practice. Get this, he gave her a Quran and a prayer mat, and she actually taught herself the 5 daily prayers by watching YouTube videos. And even after that relationship ended, the practice stuck. It felt like her duty now. Her commitment got so strong that she even tried wearing the hijab for a while, really trying to be what she saw as a good Muslim.
At the exact same time, Majid was heading in the complete opposite direction. Those little questions he had as a kid about rituals, they'd grown into these massive fundamental doubts about morality, about science. He just couldn't square things like Islamic laws on slavery or violence with his own conscience. And all these doubts eventually boiled down to this one powerful idea he calls the accident of birth argument. Basically, that your faith is less about some divine truth and more about where you just happen to be born.
Okay, so let's just pause for a second. We have two people, similar backgrounds, who walked in totally opposite directions for years, one getting more religious, one less. So what was it? What was the final tipping point that made both of their paths converge and lead them to the exact same place?
For both of them, there really was a final straw, a moment where the questions just got too loud to ignore anymore.
And of course, their final reasons were just as different as their journeys. For Chana, the break was sudden, like a shocking discovery. She was on internet forums and stumbled upon parts of the Hadith, the sayings and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, that she had never ever seen before. And these texts just deeply clashed with her personal values. In her own words, she just couldn't accept a faith that insults my person and my intellect. Now, for Majid, it wasn't a sudden shock. It was more of a final confirmation. All those years of doubt just solidified. He came to the core belief that the faith was simply incompatible with the modern free society that he valued so much. And this is it. This is the point where their two very different roads finally merge into one. You had one path defined by this deep dive into faith, followed by a sudden crisis, and the other defined by slow, mounting doubt.
And yet, unbelievably, they both led to the exact same place, a shared conclusion about who they are.
So why is this so important? Well, because both of them point to the exact same thing, their French Western upbringing. They say that's what gave them the tools they needed to question their own beliefs. Chana specifically mentioned learning how to ask questions, how to doubt, things she picked up in French schools. And Majid said, look, the values of freedom and reason I grew up with just made my old faith impossible to hold on to.
So at the end of the day, this wasn't really about rejecting their heritage and just picking a new one. Not at all. It was about integration. It was about taking both parts of their experience and weaving them together to build a new identity, one that was really grounded in those universal values of freedom, reason, and equality they'd absorbed growing up in France.
And all of this leaves us with a pretty powerful question to think about, doesn't it? Their two incredible paths really highlight this profound and honestly often unpredictable dance between the culture we're raised in and the conscience we end up building for ourselves.